Donald Trump proposes relocating the Palestinians from Gaza to Jordan and Egypt. The USAID scandal tops the list of malfeasant federal spending. Can the federal budget process be reformed to produce better results for the American people? And finally, several proposals have been put forward to alter U.S. military procurement policies. Welcome to Inside Israel News, your home for American conservative commentary on international affairs and thorough and unbiased analysis of Israeli news, politics, and current events in the Middle East. Or as the internet trolls say, mouthpiece of the Zionist conspiracy, spokesman for the elders of Zion, highly paid propagandist of the Mossad. Yeah, no. This is Inside Israel News. I'm your host, Mensch-Kight. Welcome back, Insiders. In just over a week, as I promised, I will get on posting these episodes a little more often. I'm trying. As always, your gregarious Vulcan, your prophet of things to come, your shadow president, although not so much in opposition these days, as it's great to have Donald Trump back in office, but, you know, I'm still out here pitching my ideas, and I'll disagree with the Donald every once in a while, but generally speaking, his policies are the ones that I would embrace. And the policies, I mean, my friends, every day Donald Trump drops a bomb on the media, and it's some big news story. So, I mean, I posted my last episode on Monday. I'd recorded it Sunday night. And by Monday, of course, I mentioned in the episode, as listeners will note, the tariffs, right? The Trump had put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and that was the big news. And then Monday, he spoke with Sheinbaum, Presidente Sheinbaum in Mexico, and then up in Canada with Prime Minister Trudy, Justin Trudeau, I like to call Trudy. Anyway, and just like that, it's magic, my friends. Like Trump had waved his wand and went, expecto my fentanyl. The border security issue came up, and Mexico's cracking down on the cartels. They've already arrested a kingpin or two. They're starting to send troops to the border. Canada is also tightening up on drugs. It's like magic. I mean, you create leverage, which would be, access to the largest consumer economy in the world. And honestly, really the only consumer economy in the world anymore, since other developed countries have demographic issues, right? I mean, the fact is the people over 65 don't consume as much as people under 30. Let's just say. And your biggest consumers are between 30 and 40. Well, there are fewer and fewer of those anymore in places like China and Europe. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to get way off, I digress. What do you want to hear, my friends? We got to talk about Gaza because, Trump did that on Monday, and then a few days later, it's this Gaza thing, and I'm like, oh my God, I've got to get an episode out. I'm just telling you, it's not me. It's just everything that's happening, and it's happening so quickly. But I feel like a complete schlemiel. I can't stay on top of all this stuff. It's happening so fast. Like, I'm being klutzy. I'm not getting the job done. I'm just, I'm hopeless. Okay. Gaza. Let's talk about Gaza. And after that, and I'm going to do a little bit of different format today. I'm just going to go topical instead of breaking it up into America, Israel, and international. I have a few topics I need to jump from one to one. I'm hearing good feedback about that. So, a bunch of you guys apparently liked the year in review episode. Listener William, you know who you are, sent me a message saying he really appreciated that episode, thought it was the best one in the last little while. I think the episode where I predicted the outcome of the election pretty accurately was good. But that obviously I was able to kind of bring the whole year together in that one episode, and I had a good time with that. So glad to hear feedback from him. A few other people have commented that it was a good episode. So there you go. But if you want to know what's going to happen next, this is the place to go. Of course, I said in the last episode what was likely to happen with the tariffs. I just wasn't sure what price Trump would ask for. But basically, I mean, we're not going to put tariffs on Mexico and Canada unless we have to. They're going to obviously play ball. They need our economy. So, it's like, it's a small thing to do. Like, can we have some more security? Fentanyl is literally killing our young people. Like, could we stop? Please. A lot of it comes from China anyway. Oh, all right. Gaza. All right. Let's get on topic. So first topic, Trump says he wants to relocate the Palestinians from Gaza and rebuild Gaza under U.S. control. And it'll be like a resort, maybe. Lots of people are going to live there from wherever, he says. Some of his officials have tried to walk it back a little bit in the administration, but Trump has doubled down. He says we're going to take it over and we're going to move everybody out of there. There are purportedly 2 million Palestinian Arabs living there. Not quite sure. But he says he's going to move them. Half to Egypt, half to Jordan, purportedly. King Abdullah of Jordan was just in Washington recently, and Donald Trump talked with him directly. Obviously, the governments of Jordan and Egypt are very much against this. The Egyptians are literally sending their army to the Sinai, building up their forces along the Rafah crossing and on that side of the Gaza Strip to prevent the Palestinians from coming in. The Egyptians do not want the Palestinians. We'll come back to that later. So, where we're at here, okay? First thing that we got to talk about. Donald Trump is a strategic genius, okay? The chessboard of this particular move is so beautiful that let's just take a moment to look at it from the 30,000-foot bird's eye view and just say, wow. I mean, whether you support it, oppose it, whatever, look at this move, all right? It's checkmate, no matter what you do, right? So if the Egyptians and the Jordanians agree, or other countries agree to take the Palestinians, then they go. And there's no more conflict with Gaza. And it'll be rebuilt as something else, right? Wow. Okay, that's one possible thing. If Egypt and Jordan don't want to be saddled with 1 million each of the Palestinians for good reasons that they wouldn't want them, then they need to come up with an alternative. Maybe Jordanian and Egyptian security forces going into Gaza and destroying Hamas and rebuilding it as something other than a terror camp, right? If that happens, that's still a good thing for the U.S. We'd be happy to finance it, of course, and the reconstruction and all of that, provided that we know Hamas is actually being destroyed, okay? Great thought there, okay? And anything in between, maybe, a third of them leave and they rebuild, any policy in between. It's beautiful. The U.S. has the power to do it. Israel doesn't. Israel can't propose relocating them. Israel doesn't have the ability to rebuild Gaza. I mean, with the resources, like if the U.S. put up the money or what have you, theoretically Israel could lead that effort, but there's too much bad blood. I mean, and also, as I've said before on this podcast, I don't want our fine young men and women having to police Gaza, right? Having Israeli troops there is an eyesore. It's not a good thing. Securing the border crossings and all that, yes, that we have to do. But I don't want our people in there getting killed and attacked and maimed by these people, okay, no, right? Neither do I want U.S. forces to do the same. But if the U.S. could help facilitate the relocation, hey. Second thing, all right, voluntary versus involuntary. So there's all these people, they're going to involuntarily locate no, it's so terrible. Really? My friends, if you were living in a tent in a rubble-strewn area that used to be a city at one time, and Hamas is going around shooting people in the legs on the streets and torturing people in the streets and executing people in the streets everywhere they can. Public executions, public torture, public shootings, and maimings to reassert their power. We are in charge here, right? Okay, if that's your daily condition, Hamas oppression and rubble, living in a tent, and someone came along and said, hey, you can move to Egypt and live in a house. In Egypt. We're going to resettle you to a house in Egypt. I'm sorry, I don't see how you don't take that deal. Okay? There are some people, this is my home, I'm staying. Fine. Okay? But you start with the people who will go voluntarily. I'm pretty sure half the people there would be willing to leave voluntarily if they had the choice. We've seen in the past, a lot of Arabs have wanted to sell out of the Judea and Samaria, out of Gaza, what have you, but they get persecuted by other Arabs if they sell to Jews, right? I had the deputy mayor of Jerusalem on for an interview one time, and one of the things he talked about is the efforts we make to buy houses and buy land from Arabs in Jerusalem, and then if they want to go live somewhere else, they can. Right? They have, freedom of movement, right? We can buy the land, and if they want to move, that's fine. I mean, that's fair. Okay. So that's another thing. All right. More dimensions. So there's where to go first. So there's the question of legitimacy. On whose authority is America going to relocate these people? As Donald Trump says, the authority of the United States. But let me address another issue. My good friend Bob Zeidman in the Good Intentions newsletter, and Bob's a great author. He's written a couple of books, Animal Lab, Good Intentions in particular, that are fun conservative books. You get to read and have entertainment, have a good laugh at wokeness, and you can read entertainment that has your values. You know what I'm saying? It's not woke, and there's none of these silly things in there. So Bob shared in his newsletter an article by Daniel Pomerantz about the international law question here. And I'm just going to read you an excerpt. Right? U.S. President Donald Trump articulated a plan to, quote, take ownership of Gaza, unquote, and relocate the local population during Reconstruction, triggering a storm of absolute rhetorical panic. Claims ranging from violations of international law to ethnic cleansing, expulsion, and forced displacement dominate global headlines. Yet these claims all have one thing in common. None of them are legally true. Senior Hamas official Sami Abu Zuri referred to a Palestinian evacuation plan of Gaza as expulsion from their land. Hassan al-Hassan, a fellow at the Bahrain-based think tank, claims evacuation is forced displacement and a reference to acts prohibited under the Geneva Conventions, right? Reuters throws out the phrase ethnic cleansing, and the BBC simply described Trump's plan as flying in the face of international law. He goes on to note that Gazans want to leave, right? Gaza isn't home. Theoretically, these people claim that they're from inside Israel, and there's no right of return, so they're not going back to Israel, right? So he cleverly articulates this point, okay? UN Watch's Hillel Neuer put it succinctly. If Palestinians in Gaza are refugees, then why is it wrong for Jordan and Egypt to welcome them? If you object to this and say it would uproot them from their homes and lands in Gaza, then why are they being called refugees? In short, according to both Palestinian leadership and the United Nations, Gaza is not a home to most of these residents, and residents therefore do not enjoy rights to stay there or to return there, according to both Article 49 of the Geneva Conventions as well as other international laws and treaties. This would be true even if forced population transfer were prohibited by international law. Yet in this case, such a transfer is explicitly permitted. All right, so that's a really good point Bob shared there in that article. Just, all this nonsense about relocation. We've had so many relocations in history, voluntary and otherwise, like Germans from Eastern Europe, that are not fun, okay? But, in this case, a temporary or even permanent resettlement would be preferable to living in tents and preferable to living under Hamas. I mean, God, anything would be preferable to living under Hamas, right? That's just a horrible thing. Okay, so Trump's strategy here is clearly breaking down the usual, right? We get these things where we have these peace processes and everyone gets groupthink and they get blinders on, right? I love riding horses. And as you know, if you've watched some of my walking videos that I posted on X, I filmed some of them while riding or while tying up the horse. And with the blinders on, I mean, a horse can only see straight in front of it. It can't see off to the side, so it's less likely to be panicked by other things. We get these groupthink and these focuses. So we get this peace process, and we got to have a two-state solution, we don't know this kind of thing. But let's get out of that box. Let's start thinking in broader terms. Let's start coming up with other solutions. And one way to do that is to propose a solution so radical, so out there, so far out in left field that no one would ever think, and make it practical. And then all of a sudden, any alternative, if someone were willing to propose one, would be something we'd be willing to entertain. But in the meantime, we have a plan. Right? Just like with the Build the Wall, everybody was like, well, who's going to pick the grapes in Silicon Valley, and who's going to, or in the Central Valley of California, right? Who's going to come pick the crops and the strawberries, and if we don't have immigrants to come and take them, and this kind of thing. It's like, so we'll use automation. We could create a guest worker program, right? So Donald Trump broke down all that stuff by saying, build a wall. We all understand the concept of a wall. Wall means no entry. And whether it works or not, it is symbolic. It tells the people who are south of the border, you may not enter. We do not want you to come here. And already, as Trump has begun deporting people, a lot of people are returning voluntarily. They realize they are unwelcome. Okay, so the point is, Trump is just coming at it with an outside-the-box thing. Now, the point I want to add for me, and I've said this many times, and I came to believe this back in the aughts. I read a lot of books from 2000 to 2006 because as somebody who supports Israel, as a young yid, and as an American, why can't they make peace? Why won't Israel do this? And we had a lot of people on the left, and I was a liberal at the time, to be fair. I was also going through my transition to being more conservative, as it were, and making my exodus. But in any case, as I was looking at the situation, reading all of these books, one of the books I read was Dennis Ross, his book on the negotiations Bill Clinton held with the Palestinians, called The Missing Peace, P-E-A-C-E, peace as in the lack of war. And he talks about how the Palestinians completely sabotaged the negotiations, that it was very close to being done, and they sabotaged it. Well, it led me to realize, as I was reading all of these various books, Right to Exist, right, it was a great book on Israel from that time, and I realized the Palestinians are never going to make peace. They don't want peace. They want war, right? Polls before October 7th show that Hamas was winning the elections. If the elections had been held in the Palestinian territories, then Hamas would have won. Ismail Haniyeh had a huge lead to be president. That's why Mahmoud Abbas didn't hold an election, because he knows he'd be unseated. So the Palestinians overwhelmingly support Hamas, this violent terrorist organization that committed the horrors of October 7th, right? They don't want peace. They want to murder Israelis. They want Israel destroyed, right? And they say so all the time. So once you realize that, you're like, okay, so what could change that, right? What could bring a culture change? Well, the rest of the Arab world has gotten over it. Egypt, Jordan, they've made peace with Israel. UAE, Bahrain, they've normalized with Israel. Morocco, Saudis are talking about it. Well, they could go in and teach these people something else, right? We don't know. Maybe that's a possibility there. What I discovered back in 506, in that era, especially with the Gaza withdrawal and all of that, was that really the only way to achieve peace with the Palestinians, if it were even possible, and I'm not sure that it is. A couple of great debates online with different people, well, you can't make peace with these people. I'm with you. I'm generally in agreement, but follow me on this. If peace is going to be possible, we have to create a situation in which the Palestinians know they have completely lost, that they have absolutely no hope of ever achieving their goal. Only then, kicked, beaten, laying on the ground, half dead, will they consider making peace. Perhaps, in that situation, their sense of self-preservation might be stronger than their racism and their hatred for Jews, right? But I don't know, and I've talked about many times in past episodes, you can go back and listen to them. It is Palestinian racism, their unwillingness to accept Jews as equals living in the land, even when Jews were a minority, right? It's been this attitude of the Jews are our dogs, right? They've been unwilling to accept a respectable Jewish minority. They've been unwilling to accept a Jewish state. They want us all dead, and they'll do whatever they have to achieve that. Well, what could change that? Total defeat. If we can talk openly now about relocating the Palestinians, if that's something that is a very real possibility, they have lost. None of these neo-Nazi kafia protests on campus is going to stop this, right? No objections from Emmanuel Macron or Keir Starmer or, Germany's going to have a new chancellor soon. We'll see what Chancellor Merz, future Chancellor Merz, might say about it. But at the moment, no European leader can stop this. Donald Trump is the leader of the most powerful country in the world. His word is policy, and his will is law. We can make anything happen. Anything. So, there you go. In that situation, it might be a good idea for them to drop the racism. And honestly, if the Palestinians would stop killing us and stop teaching their children to kill us and change that culture, in 20 or 30 years, we could talk about something. Quite possibly, when the next generation has grown up with different attitudes. At the moment, and this is the final point I want to make, we are talking about people. I'm going to talk about things that are sensitive and graphic. So if you might want to fast forward a couple minutes if you don't want to hear that. We're talking about people who raised sons who could, on 10/7, on October 7th, went into Israel and put babies in ovens, beheaded babies, shot children, raped and murdered teenagers, cut the breasts off of women, cut the foot off an 8-year-old, and the fingers off a 6-year-old boy, an 8-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy, cut their father's nose off, and then tied their whole family together with wire and set them on fire with gasoline, right? What kind of people could do that? All right? Now, my children growing up following my example, I cannot imagine my children, I don't know what it would take to get into a fight with them. They're very patient and very calm. But I mean, if you attack them, I'm sure, they'll defend themselves. But I just don't imagine them ever being capable of such horrors. So what kind of culture raises that kind of people? Okay? These people, the Palestinians, are the scum of the earth. They are the most vile people with the most despicable culture. All right? And you don't have to take it from me. Take it from the Egyptians, take it from the Jordanians. If these people were decent people that they thought they could integrate into their societies, they'd take them. They need the labor. They could use more soldiers in the army, right? If these people were useful people who could be settled and civilized and decent human beings, they'd take them, right? They're not. Okay? Now, when I say they're the scum of the earth, I'm not saying I'm not dehumanizing them. I'm not saying, they dehumanize themselves. I am not dehumanizing them more than they have dehumanized themselves by their own actions and their own culture. Okay? I'm not saying it justifies genocide or ethnic cleansing or any of this kind of crap. I am saying these are the kinds of people who raise children capable of committing such horrors. All right? If any of my children committed such horrors, I would shoot them myself. You cannot live with a person like that. A person like that is a criminal and a mass murderer and a psychopath. You can't let such people live. Right? The Bible says, life for a life. If a person can kill another person, you must destroy the killer. Right? So that's what I'm saying. All right? These people need to change. And that's the point. That culture, that scum of the earth, that needs to change. These people need to choose to be civilized human beings and embrace human decency. Okay? The Nazis chose to be monsters. These people have an entire culture of monstrosity. They celebrate the murder of children. I mean, it's horrible, my friends. Okay, so could that change? Yes, it could change. But I talked about the interview Naftali Bennett did with Jordan Peterson. You can go watch it if you want. He talked about Germany, West Germany, right? I mean, the United States rebuilt West Germany. Polls and statistics and surveys afterwards show that Germans really didn't change their opinion. Anti-Semitism was still pretty high. Nationalism was still pretty high. Germans didn't change their attitudes much. What happened was they accepted their defeat. This psychopath, Hitler, had been in power. He got them into a war that they could not win, and it completely destroyed their country. And all of their suffering resulted from that. And so regardless of their anti-Semitism and regardless of their nationalist aspirations, they put all of that to one side and said, hey, we have to be decent human beings and we have to stop doing that. We can't go back in that direction. And German culture today is completely different. When I say that people change, the generation that fought the war didn't change much. Future generations of Germans have changed considerably. Okay, then they brought in immigrants who, unfortunately, are very anti-Semitic, so that doesn't help. But the point is, Japan, right? Japan faced a total defeat. Even the emperor, the descendant of the sun god, was humbled, right? And the people of Japan accepted to a certain degree. Maybe not as much as the Germans and probably not as much as they should have, but they recognized that they lost. And as a result, they were able to rebuild a beautiful and wonderful society without the evils that preceded it. That's what needs to happen with the Palestinians. How is that going to be achieved? My friends, I can't do that. Israel can't do that. Okay, only the Palestinians can do that. And if anyone can help them, if anyone can take them by the hand, or better yet, put a hand on the back of their neck, slam them on the ground, and scream into their ear in Arabic, you must change. You are the scum of the earth and you need to be better than this. It's going to be Egyptians or Jordanians. It's going to be other people like them. Those are the people who can go in, who understand the culture, who speak the language, who can push these people to become something better than they are. I would like to believe the best of people, and I think if these people stopped teaching their children to be terrorists and stopped trying to kill Israelis, in a generation they could be better people. Now, the bar is pretty low. It's not hard to be better than the people who committed October 7th, okay? All right. Anyway, also, as I discussed in the last episode, Iran is not going to be a factor. Iran is in deep trouble. They have problems closer to home. They're desperately trying to hold on to Iraq at this point on their front porch and keep the Houthis going. And they're in desperate shape with both of those as it is. So they're fighting on the front porch. Iran is not riding to the rescue. Hezbollah is isolated in Lebanon. Hamas is isolated in Gaza. They have no support. They have no help. Okay? So there you go. So Trump has picked this strategy. It's a win-win for everyone. Either some of them voluntarily relocate and the rest stay. Maybe some of them are temporarily relocated and then brought back. Maybe Arab governments come in there and take over and change the situation on the ground and the culture. All right? But whatever happens, something big will have to happen, or Donald Trump's going to follow through on his promise. And that is beautiful strategy. Okay? That puts the queen right there on the chessboard where any move you make will put the king in check. You see what I'm saying? So there you go. Okay. Whew. That is a pretty testy topic. Morally, obviously, we can't murder people, and forcible relocation is not pleasant. It can be morally justified in certain situations. I know it's an unpleasant thing, but after the Second World War, it's hard to argue that the Germans living in Hungary should stay in Hungary, right? I mean, after Hitler used the excuse of Germans living in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia to conquer these other countries, right? I mean, and the way Germans had treated those people, it's understandable that they didn't want to have Germans living in their countries anymore. I mean, I'm not endorsing it. I don't think it's right. I think those countries might have been better off if they had found a way to integrate their German populations. They ended up doing them a favor anyway because those countries all became communist, and most of the Germans relocated to West Germany. Many of them ended up in East Germany too, but a lot of those Germans ended up in the free side of Germany. So, they definitely were better off there than they were behind the Iron Curtain. My point is, the same thing applies here. It's not pleasant. It's not nice. We wouldn't rather not have to do this. Or propose this or follow through on it. But also we would rather not have babies put in ovens. Okay? That's your choice. Now I've said what I've had to say. And, I hope that something will happen and the Arab governments will step up and take charge of the situation and take over the rebuilding, finish off Hamas, build something in its place to ensure that Hamas never comes back, and help these people become more decent. Again, that's a low bar. It's not hard to become more decent. So do something with it. All right. That went on a little bit longer than I intended. So I'm going to go to the break here. And when I get back from the break, I will talk about, and much more briefly on each of these, the rest of the topics that I want to cover today. Visit the Inside Israel News store on Etsy to get your swag and support the show at the same time. You can get the Promised Land shirt or the Now You're Messing with the Son of a Mensch shirt or other interesting swag, phone cases, and such at the store. Go to Etsy, look up Inside Israel News, or you can go to the website, insideisrael.news, and click on the image of the store, of the items for sale. Get your swag and show your support for Israel today. Well, that last segment took a little longer than I intended, so I'll be dancing through the rest of these topics much more quickly in the hopes of, in the interests of brevity and in the hopes of an episode that isn't 10 hours long. And when I get episodes that are over 2 hours, that's too much, but oftentimes there's a lot to talk about. So I'm trying to get these done faster, and I'm even changing the format to try to get the time down a little bit. And all right, so the USAID scandal. I've talked on the podcast before about how we know that money that goes to the Palestinian Authority, right, Mahmoud Abbas over in Judea and Samaria, up to Ramallah there, that money goes to support terrorism, right? They do this pay-to-play thing where they give pensions to the families of terrorists, right? So if your son goes off and kills a bunch of Jews, whether he ends up in prison or dead or whatever, you get a pension. The family gets a pension. And we've known for a long time that aid sent by the European Union, they sent a bunch of concrete to Gaza, and we know that was being used by terrorists, right? So it's not a surprise that aid sent to the Palestinians is being used for terrorism, okay? We've also known that aid sent to Gaza by the Biden administration is going to Hamas, right? Because any money that goes into Gaza goes to Hamas. They are the dictators, right? They run that place. So no matter what you do, the money's going to end up in the hands of Hamas. But that USAID was directly financing the building of the tunnels. I mean, not quite directly, but they were financing the building of the tunnels in Gaza. And that is unacceptable. And that is so much worse than transgender surgeries in Guatemala. In those cases, only a few people get hurt, unfortunately. Mentally ill people who need treatment are mutilated instead. But what happened in Gaza and 10/7, I mean, we helped the enemies of our ally commit an atrocity. And all the rhetoric we got out of the Biden administration about how they were supporting Israel and all this kind of nonsense. Meanwhile, USAID was paying for the tunnels. Brilliant. Just so many things that the aid was going to. But one of the big ones that I thought about, and I kind of started talking about this a little bit last year, is, who watches CNN? Who watches MSNBC? Who reads Politico? Who reads the New York Times, right? Why are these left-wing news outlets still in business if no one's watching? Because increasingly centrist Democrats are tuning out from these places. They realize that they're full of it. Right, that all their stuff and all their, all their feel good, tell you what you want to hear stuff is diluted, and that you need to get with reality, right? It's a bubble. It's like talking in a bubble, like everybody on your side, right? And it's just, how, why are these still in business? Well, now we know. Apparently, 8% of Politico's revenue was USAID. And NASA and other organizations, and 4% of Reuters and the New York Times is getting money. And so they were using U.S. money to pay for propaganda. Now, we all saw how during the Biden administration, whatever the administration said was immediately parroted by the media. Their position was immediately all over the media, right? And any opposition to it was immediately poo-pooed. Oh, the Republicans are just mean. They're just awful. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Well, now we know why. I mean, it's not just the woke mind virus. It's not just that all these people are part of a collective mind and don't think for themselves. It's because they were being paid, right? Beautiful. Well, now I will tell you, Gen Z, like you would not believe, Gen Z is furious. All their lives, they've been told by millennials and Gen Xers and boomers that corporate corruption is bad and corporate welfare is bad and the government and the corporations and the Republicans and the corporation, all this stuff is bad. The Democrats are good, but all the corporations are bad. Comcast, they're evil. Monsanto, they're evil, right? And now we're finding out that the Democrats were in bed with all of these institutions. They were the man. Forget Big Pharma. I mean, we're talking about financing the media. So Gen Z is ticked. And if you watch some of their videos, TikTok, which is still active, or on Reels or in other video platforms, what have you, there are a lot of young men and young women who are not conservatives, who are flaming hot, absolutely furious at the Democrats and at the system. So the Democrat Party now has 2-1 unfavorability. It's like 64% unfavorable, 31% favorable. I mean, 2-1, my friends. And this is why, right? And they're trying to stall the confirmations and all this kind of thing. But, you know, so it's a huge scandal. I'm just so grateful we have Elon Musk going through all this stuff, because when Trump won last time, he had no idea the depth of the corruption and the problems that we have. And now it's taken this effort to get out there and do this stuff. I mean, Johnny Ernst was trying to get to the bottom of USAID for some time, and, you know, they threatened her politically and attacked her and all this kind of stuff. So it's like, you know, as a politician, it's just easier to keep your mouth shut, right? Not Johnny Ernst. I mean, she kept going after them, but now we know why they were trying to silence her. Okay, so that's an absolute mess. Right. Speaking of confirmations, obviously some of them are going through. We're waiting for, as I'm recording this, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, and Kash Patel. Once those three are in, I mean, the rest of them aren't as controversial. I think the controversy seems to be around these three in particular. And I just want to say this once. The American people voted. They voted for Donald Trump, but they voted for a coalition. This is the first time in a long time, and I'm trying to think of a real coalition concept in American history, but this is the first time in a long time where vast political groups, vastly different political groups came together around one presidential candidate. Now, that kind of thing can happen, and disparate groups will vote different ways. But in this particular case, it manifested itself very physically in the form of RFK Jr. RFK Jr., who was running for president on the left, quit his campaign and endorsed Donald Trump. He very deliberately said, Trump is the guy, vote for him, right? So his being HHS, his confirmation secretary of Health and Human Services, that really shouldn't be in question. I mean, the American people clearly voted for this coalition. A lot of Democrats voted for Trump and did not vote Republican down ballot. We know this. And it's RFK and Tulsi Gabbard that convinced them to do that. So these two need to be confirmed to their positions. I'm looking forward just to seeing the shakeup, to see people running for the hills. Tulsi Gabbard has had some disappointing, so has RFK, disappointing rhetoric on Russia, but I think they're going to get with the program, And it'll be interesting to see what Bobby Kennedy Jr. does at Health and Human Services. But I'm really, really excited about Kash Patel getting into office, and that's going to be good. We also just got the commission the president set up with Ana Paulina Luna, the congresswoman, who is going to start the declassifying of the JFK files, the Epstein list, and all that kind of stuff. Let's do it. Let's see. Get all this stuff out in the air. There's been references to the possibility of a second shooter, not Oswald. I don't know. I mean, we'll see. We'll see what they say. I think the main thing you're going to find out from the Kennedy files is that our government is grossly incompetent and did a terrible job of trying to protect the president. But I think we knew that already. So we'll see what comes out of that. All right. Real quick, because we're already getting there, like the generic Democrat is getting clobbered in 2026. Usually, when you have an election like this one, even a landslide election, This was sort of a landslide. I mean, all of the battleground states went to Trump, right? Usually, the party in power doesn't poll very well after they come to power. Usually, it gets negative. There's buyer's remorse, and also as politics sets in, and it's typical, usual politics, and they start looking and, ooh, we get to control the budget. The money's going to go to whatever we want now, that kind of thing. You don't get the reforms that were promised. The enthusiasm and the excitement dies out, okay? Not this time. The Jarek Republican is clobbering the Democrats for the House of Representatives. And in the Senate, we're seeing something similar. GOP is looking good to hold on to all of its seats. There are going to be difficult races for the GOP to defend in Maine. I'm trying to think. Florida and Ohio are actually going to be pretty good. I mean, the main issue there is that the incumbents, namely Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, are holding other offices now as Sec State and Vice President, respectively. So they're not in position to run as incumbents. That means there are new appointed candidates there, and so that does create a vulnerability. They're not as popular or as well known. But those are pretty good red states right there in Ohio and Florida. I don't think we're going to see, I don't think they're in much jeopardy. Democrats, on the other hand, are going to have to defend Michigan, where Slotkin's not running again, so that's an open seat, and Georgia as well, where Ossoff is running for another term. You remember he beat Purdue back in 2020, and it was a dumb election. They had a runoff in January, right before January 6th. It was crazy. It was a weird year, weird election laws. Why? The whole thing was, as we used to say in the military, a big WTF, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, right? What happened here? Now, Anthony Warnock managed to win re-election, against Herschel Walker. But now we have, the opportunity to knock off Ossoff. Governor Kemp could run, and it looks like he's popular enough to win. All right, so there's a good chance that the outgoing governor could beat the senator and get himself a Senate seat. That would be a one-seat gain for the GOP right there. And likewise in Michigan, with Slotkin leaving, Mike Rogers looking to run for governor there as a longtime representative, or for Senate, running for Senate in Michigan, longtime representative, well-known, good option. Pete Buttigieg, who's from South Bend, Indiana, was the mayor there. Like, he's talking about moving up to Michigan to run for Senate. Like, Hillary Clinton wasn't enough for you. You're going to have Democrat politicians moving to different states to get a Senate seat. I mean, he knows he'd never have a prayer in Indiana. So, but anyway, new poll out. Mike Rogers has a 6-point lead so far. So, right there, if Susan Collins can win re-election, she's pretty left as a Republican, and Maine is a blue state, not a red state. So, I think she's had enough. Been discerning enough that she might get herself reelected. The GOP could gain 2 seats in the Senate, go from 53 to 55. That would be a very confident and secure majority in the Senate. And could be a long-term majority, not necessarily. But this class of senators has a lot of GOP senators. The GOP is going to be on the defensive for the most part. I just wanted to talk about that because already 2026 is getting set up, the midterm elections. And it's exciting. It's kind of interesting. With all the illegal immigrants that are leaving and being deported, and any efforts at voter security, at ID requirements, clearing off the voter rolls, this kind of stuff, combined with the general unpopularity of the Democrats at the moment, there's a pretty good chance the GOP will gain seats in the House as well. And then we'll have a more comfortable majority. It won't rely as much on Moscow Marjorie, Taylor Greene, and who's essentially a foreign agent of Russia, and Thomas Massie, the neo-Nazi Republican who's a big anti-Semite, and So if we could have a majority that doesn't require their votes, that would be appreciated. We don't need nutters deciding what legislation passes or doesn't pass. basically the majority is so slim that the Democrats are needed to help pass bills. And some Democrats are trying to save their skins. I mean, they recognize that they're not popular, and so it would be kind of smart to vote for some of these reforms and be able to run on that. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you. I've written a thing on policies for the people, which is really nice. RFK created this website. You can just go there and pitch your ideas, from as simple as I think we should require voter ID to I have a plan to secure the election by 1, having voter ID, 2, having better voting machine. You can go as much detail as you want, or just make a simple statement. And I wrote there on the budget process. How could we improve it? The budget process right now is a mess. We have these continuing resolutions. The Congress doesn't actually write a budget. Nothing quite works like it should. And so, first of all, you want to say, Congress should get back to doing business the right way. They all know the right way of doing things. They don't want to do it that way because they just want to blow a whole bunch of money, right? So that's not good. There's also some reforms that need to be made in the executive. Obviously, we're seeing with USAID, and recently the CFO of over at Homeland Security gave $59 million to for the luxury hotels, for illegal immigrants being housed in luxury hotels in New York when there were explicit orders to the contrary, got fired. Right, but we have a malfeasant bureaucracy. So the two, that's another issue. The bureaucracy is being downsized, and it needs to be true to the budget. Then we need to fix the budgeting process. So I'm only focused on the budgeting process. I have a couple of notions. Since revenue bills have to start in the House, according to the Constitution, that is tax bills affecting taxes, I think that the budget bill should start there too. The House of Representatives should draw up the budget. Right? And it should be a budget saying we have taxes, here are all of our anticipated revenues on one side, and here are all of our expenditures on the other, right? And then they pass a budget with line items for the different things where things are supposed to go and what money is for, and grants and all of that. And then that goes on to the Senate. Now, Henry Hazlitt had a really fascinating idea. For those who don't know, Henry Hazlitt was a journalist in the mid-20th century, big free marketeer. Right? He's a very free market guy. He wrote a book in which he talked about potential constitutional reforms. And one of the things he talked about was, what if the Senate could reduce or eliminate expenditures but not increase them? Right? So the Senate would be able to change the budget but could not increase it. I would put that a little differently. And I don't know if I'd go by line item. I would just say overall. The Senate could adjust the budget, but it has to remain revenue neutral, spending neutral. In other words, if the House sends a budget for $4 trillion to the Senate, wouldn't that be beautiful? God, the budget's like $6-7 trillion now. Anyway, let's just say they send a budget to the Senate for $4.01683 trillion. The Senate could not increase that budget at all. They could shift some money from social services to defense, or shift this line item to that line item, or that kind of thing, make those proposals, but they could not increase spending, right? So that would be that. And then the House will look at the Senate version, and they might accept some of the Senate's changes, propose some others. And this is usually what's done in conference committee. I think it can be done with the full houses. Basically, they reconcile with one another. Right, the House will make compromises with the Senate will make compromises with the House, and they will reach a budget that they agree on, right, with its line items, a whole budget bill, defense, social spending, the whole thing in one big bill, right? Then it would go to the president. Now, we've talked, you're hearing a lot of talk now about the presidential power of impoundment, where the president used to have the power not to spend money. Right, basically to impound funds. Started with Thomas Jefferson in 1801. There were $50,000 was appropriated for building gunboats on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, and by 1803, basically, we were buying Louisiana. In 1801, the situation with France calmed down. Right, we made peace. So he impounded $50,000, which was a lot of money in 1801. He impounded the money. He just said, look, we don't need these gunboats anymore. The military situation, the political situation, it's changed. We don't need it. Well, that's That's the power of impound. Congress pushed back against Richard Nixon because they thought he was pushing the impoundment too far, and that restricted the presidential power of impound. The courts have kind of gone along with that. The Congress does have significant power to decide how other branches of government may use their powers. But we can bring back the impound in a way by allowing the president to have a line item veto. Now, the line item veto was determined to be unconstitutional, but in this case, I think we have a way around that unconstitutionality because I think we have a better Supreme Court now. But my argument here, right, because impoundment has been legal until Congress made it illegal, right? Instead of looking at it as a line item veto, you look at it as a form of impoundment. Congress writes a budget bill, sends it to the president, and the president, instead of impounding funds later, impounds them up front and just goes through it and says, there's $2 million that is appropriated for research on such and such a thing. I think it should be $1 million. I'm going to eliminate the whole line item for this aircraft carrier. We don't need this aircraft carrier, eliminating the whole line item for that. And go through and the president could nix the spending that the president doesn't think is necessary, reduce and or eliminate expenditures, but never increase them, right? The president would never have that power. So the president couldn't say, for example, well, I'm going to nix this aircraft carrier, but we're going to buy these tanks over here. No, that, you have to work with, he or she would have to work with what Congress gives them. And then that could go back to Congress. And because this is kind of an impoundment rather than a veto, so technically the president is signing the budget bill into law and impounding funds. That's the way it would be written from a legal point of view. But it would work like a line item veto. So then that goes back to Congress. Congress could restore, we'll have another bill, like let's call it a supplemental budget bill, where they could restore part or all of that funding. So they sit there and they say, well, the president only wants to spend $1 million on this research project. We think it should be $1.5 million. Right? So that's still less than the $2 million originally, right? The president doesn't want this aircraft carrier. Okay, we won't get the aircraft carrier. Or maybe, you know what? We think this aircraft carrier should be built. We're putting the money back in. And so by a majority vote, Congress could vote to restore some or all of that funding. But their votes of the individual members of Congress would be on the record supporting those expenditures. So if that research project turned out to be shrimp on a treadmill, right, or some dumb thing like that, what happens if monkeys eat ice cream? I mean, they've done so many dumb research projects, God only knows, right? So if it turns out to be something dumb like that, then it'd be like, well, Congressman so-and-so, you voted for it. The president put it in his line item veto and you voted for it. So that's what I would like to do with the budget there. And I think that would be a better budget process. And then once those expenditures are set up, the executive branch should be more closely tied to spending the money the way Congress said. They've been given with the Chevron deference and all this stuff that's going away now. They've been given too much latitude in making decisions in general. The president, by executive order, should be able to drive the executive in the direction that he or she wants to. But ultimately, Congress spends money and Congress makes the law. So that still needs to be tied closely to what Congress does. And if you don't like what Congress does, as most people don't, then elect better members of Congress and push Congress to get their act together. Because, members of Congress will ultimately answer to the people if the people speak up, right? Okay, so it's just a thought. It's how I would do budgeting. I just thought I'd explain that to you guys. And, it's not a new idea. It's not entirely mine, but I think that's how I'd put it together. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about is the national debt. It's reached about $37 trillion, including all of our other liabilities, and that's a lot of money. And we haven't got a budget that we have not balanced the budget. So it's going to take major reforms and years of spending cuts to get to a balanced budget, right? And also years of growing economy. So if it took 3 to 5 years to balance the budget, we're probably still going to have like $41 trillion in debt, even if we try our best. Okay, so the debt is going to grow. Also, as the debt grows and as fiscal irresponsibility continues, so in other words, if we do nothing, interest rates are going to rise. And very tiny changes in interest rates on the U.S. debt have a huge impact. Already, the interest on the U.S. debt, on U.S. bonds now, is $870 billion a year. $870 billion a year. For comparison, by way of comparison, the defense budget's like 850. So it's $20 billion more to pay for our interest on the national debt than for our national security. Okay, that's dangerous. When countries cross that line, they usually don't come back. So if we don't make a change now, we will never be able to. We'll be insolvent, right? The British Empire fell this way. The Roman Empire fell this way. Every great power has fallen on its face when it's made these kinds of financial shenanigans. Now, it's not the thing that causes every empire to fall, and it's always just a contributing factor with other things, but debt is a big thing. So what can we do about the national debt? And I'm here to spread the good news, to spread the good word. It really isn't as big an emergency as it sounds. We really can fix this problem if we want to. And I'm going to show you how right now, doing a little bit of math. It's something our opponents on the other side can't do. They just spend money like there's no tomorrow, and they don't seem to be able to do the addition that says, if you spend this and this and this, it's more than what you're getting, right? If I spend $100,000 and I make $60,000, I've got a deficit, a huge one, and that's a big problem. Okay, so there you go. All right, there's that kind of thing. So let's talk about this debt. The first thing with the debt, and it's the insecurity that bothers me. It's the fact that we continue to be so profligate with our spending, and that's dangerous. Okay, that if we don't make the change, the interest rates will continue to rise, and a small change in interest rates could bankrupt us at this point. Okay, so follow that. That insecurity is something that Alexander Hamilton addressed when he set up our financial system in 1790 when we passed the Assumption Bill, right? At the time, the United States was $52 million in debt. There was, from the American Revolution, the Continental Congress had borrowed that money, right? There was $4 million in unpaid interest. It's $56 million if you're still doing the math. And $25 million in state debts, mostly northern states, unfortunately, that states had failed to repay at this point, right? So the total war debt from the United States was $81 million in 1790. And U.S. bonds were selling at 10% of par. For those of you who don't know, that means if you had a $100 bond, so the government paid $100 for something, right? That bond the resale value of that bond was $10. Anyway, so no one had any faith that these were ever going to be repaid. And indeed, many people wanted to repudiate that debt. Hamilton said, hey, a nation ought not to have a national debt unless it has a means of extinguishing it. In other words, you have to be paying it off. You can have a national debt as long as you're paying on it. Okay, take that in for a second, right? Like when you get a credit card, you have to make payments, right? No bank is dumb enough to lend you a whole bunch of money without making you pay something, right? More than just the interest. You have to have some plan to pay it back, right? There are loans that are structured in different ways. I'm just making the point. Like usually you have to have some plan to pay it off, okay? Anyway, so Hamilton had all that debt consolidated into one fund. It was basically refinanced through the federal government. So that $4 million in unpaid interest was refinanced into the debt. Basically, more government bonds were issued in lieu of the interest that had been paid. And the government set up a sinking fund. Basically, 80% of the federal budget for the first 10 or 12 years went into sinking the national debt. And so it would go into this fund and it would pay the principal, all of the interest due, and make a payment on the national debt. And indeed, the debt was paid down. And rather quickly, by 12 years later, in 1803, when Jefferson wanted to buy Louisiana, the United States had the best credit in the world, of any nation of the world. Of course, the Napoleonic Wars were going on. But American bonds were trading at about 4% interest, offering 4% yield, whereas bonds in Britain were at about 5%, British consols. So you have all these things that are, these countries were much riskier because they were at war and because they were so heavily in debt. So, the U.S. was able to buy Louisiana because Hamilton had set up our credit that way. And by including the Louisiana Purchase, U.S. debts by 1812 stood at about 45 million. Now, with some inflation that had happened in the meantime, 45 million wasn't as large an amount as an equal amount in 1790, okay? And that's important. Let's talk about Great Britain, okay? So after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was 1 billion pounds in debt. Now, 1815, £1 billion. And just think about that. Over the course of the 19th century, they maintained a very fiscally sensible policy. I don't want to say completely fiscally rational, but fairly fiscally conservative policy, and they paid down about 400 million pounds in debt. By 1900, British debt stood at about 628 million pounds. But through inflation, 600 million pounds was not worth as much in 1900 as it had been in 1815. So British debts were more like 400,000 pounds a century earlier. Just throw a number out there, okay? So they had paid their debt down. They basically repaid more than half the debt, even though they hadn't actually paid half of the nominal number of pounds back. So what this tells us is, and of course Britain had great credit. Going into the First World War, Britain had the best credit of any of the combatants until the United States got involved, because the U.S. had no debt at the time. But Britain had, Germany, all these countries had significant debts, substantial debts, and they borrowed themselves into oblivion in many cases. Anyway, so the lesson from the British is we can turn this national debt thing, and kind of like with Hamilton, we can turn it around very quickly. All we have to do is make payments on it. So my plan is very simple. We balance the budget and we'll start generating surpluses. And while we want to lower taxes a little bit, we keep the surpluses coming. And we keep accumulating surpluses. And of course, we're putting all of the surpluses into the national debt until the surplus reaches a 100-year payment on the national debt, which I'm guessing about 400 billion a year, because I'm assuming the debt will get over 40 trillion. So it might be 41 trillion, which would be 410 billion a year. But let's just use some round numbers. Let's say the debt gets to 40 trillion, and so a 100-year payment would be 400 billion a year, which means that in 100 years, right? So if we started doing that in, say, 2030, we make that first payment, then in 2130, we'd make the last, or 2129. The point is, in 100 years, the debt would be paid off, okay, in nominal terms, all right? But just follow me on this. So I was sitting there thinking at that, about 870. So we're talking about somewhere in the order of $1.2 trillion to make a 100-year payment on the national debt. And we just need the surplus to give us the 400 billion extra to pay above the interest. Now, the interest rate will go down because we'll start making these payments, and all of a sudden our debt will become much safer. The fact that we have a plan to pay it off will make it safer. So what I'm trying to drive at here is that will lower the interest cost and we'll be paying down the debt. Now, I think I'm pretty smart, but apparently I'm as smart as AI, because I asked Grok to calculate if there were no change in the total amount of debt today, which is 37 trillion, about, and interest rates did not change, what would a 100-year principal and interest payment on the national debt be? And Grok said that would be $1.086 trillion, so not quite 1.1 trillion. And that's assuming that the debt stayed the same and the interest stayed the same. But what my plans suggest that the debt will rise a little bit as we go to balance the budget, and that interest rates will decline over time, allowing us potentially to put more money toward principal. But basically, if we had a 1.2 trillion to put into the debt every year, it will start to decline. The interest rates will drop. Our creditworthiness will improve. And that way, if we did have a major crisis, natural disaster, economic problem, or a war, we would have credit to borrow, right? Now, in 30 years, we will pay off $12 trillion of the national debt. So using my 40 trillion number, in 30 years, the total nominal debt will be $28 trillion, right? Interest on which will be less because you have a much lower principal at that point, and those debts will be much safer. So the yields on the bonds will be lower. You'll have much lower interest rates on them. Okay, so at that point, we're in pretty good shape fiscally. At the same time, if we expect a reasonable inflation rate, could be as much as a third in 30 years. we're going to be reindustrializing here in the U.S., so we're going to see a lot of inflation naturally, and it'll get really extreme if the government spends a lot of money. But in this case, we're assuming a fiscally conservative policy. So let's just say 25%. Let's be conservative. So we have 25% inflation in 30 years, right? And after this 30 years, so the debt says it's 28 trillion, but it's worth more like 21 trillion, 21 trillion in our dollars. My point is, in 30 years, we could pay the national debt down effectively in half, lower its interest rates, and put ourselves on a very fiscally sound path. It can be done. We just have to have the will to do it. And the reason I wanted to go through all that with you and explain it is just to show that we get into situations where we panic and we're like, oh my God, how do we do that? The problem is just the spending. We just have to get that under control. There has to be a way that we can balance the budget and generate some surpluses. Okay, and of course, if we have a prosperous economy, which would help if the federal government wasn't trying to destroy the economy, that'll get better there too. Okay, so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the national debt and say, look, we could cut it in half in 30 years. It'd be no big deal. We've just got to control the spending. It really is that simple. Once we balance the budget, once we have some surpluses, put those into the national debt until they reach the 100-year mark, and then we're good. Okay, in 30 years, this problem will have solved itself, right? The debt will be much lower, much more manageable, and if we have an emergency, I mean, God forbid, my grandchildren, we should have a war or something, and they need, major natural disaster or something, they have to borrow to, they're going to be broke. All right. I was going to talk about procurement a little bit, and before I talk about Russia, Ukraine, I'm going to make this much briefer. I talked about before our strategy. Pete Hegseth gave a talk at the Pentagon where he took questions from some of the leaders there. And now that he's SecDef, Pete Hegseth is talking about his different philosophy. And he and Elon Musk and a few others have been talking generally about procurement policies. And so if you amalgamate them all, I'm not going to go into each individual. Basically, our strategy up to this point has been to procure a small number of very highly capable and very expensive, therefore, weapons platforms, right? Ergo, like the Ford class aircraft carriers, ergo, like, super expensive planes, these kinds of things. And the problem there is, as we're seeing with drones and with others, there are cheap ways to disable these things, right, or neutralize their effectiveness. So, this is not the best strategy. What we need is a large number of inexpensive platforms, smaller ships. So what I'm basically going to just offer an example, because I talked about my idea of the crazy horse drones back in the year in review, right? We could build very inexpensively, and I just threw some numbers out. If the drone cost, $50,000, or if the truck cost $100,000, for like 1.2 billion if you made these things super expensive, you could have a truck with 5 of these drones on it that could launch, anytime, right? And you could have like 20,000 of these drones in Taiwan. And China knows that if they start a war, within a minute, we could have 20,000 drones, low-flying drones that can maneuver and are super smart, because they have AI and technology that'll fly in and hit 20,000 targets in China, right? That would be a huge deterrent, and it would cost a lot of money for them to try to defend against that, to, sword and shield, right? You build a better sword, they build a better shield. By the time they spent the 30 or 40 billion dollars it would cost to build a defense against that, we might even have stealth drones at that point. We could replace our drones with stuff that's stealthy and hard to hit. More importantly, China's not going to have that kind of money to spend. And if they have to spend it on defending themselves from drones, then they're not spending that money building ships, missiles, or whatever, right? Okay. So in any case, smaller platforms. I've talked about America building potentially a Corvette, something smaller than a frigate, maybe a smaller frigate. Israel's Sa'ar class corvettes, although they are more powerful than even Britain's Type 45 destroyer, they're Israel's corvettes they're pretty small, but they're more powerful than most countries' frigates. And if we made a ship like that, just made it bigger so it was more seaworthy, with a 76 millimeter, that's 3-inch gun for those of you in Rio Linda, with a 76 millimeter cannon on there and 48 missile cells and point defenses and some torpedoes for anti-submarine and the ability to house a helicopter, That would be good, and that could be done for, the SAR class Corvette costs like $480 million, so we could do that for say 600 million, 700 million, build a cheap ship like that, and then build 100 of them, and then they can be all over the oceans, protecting the oceans and the sea trade and all that kind of thing. And you don't have to have one destroyer that can literally, is the ultimate fighting machine on the sea. Great, but when they hit it with one missile, it's now disabled and can no longer function. Right? So, if you've got 100 of these ships and 20 of them are sailing around the Pacific, that's much harder for China to disable. Okay? So that was my point. So it's good to see that philosophy being adopted. Very exciting. Okay. So I took procurement a little quicker. There'll be more on that in the future, as I'll talk more about those kinds of things in the future. All right. Last thing is Russia-Ukraine. Main thing I wanted to talk about, and again, I'm going to keep this really brief, is the situation as it stands. Zelensky has said he's willing to negotiate. He just came out with a statement. He'd be willing to trade occupied land in Kursk that Ukraine occupies of Russia for land in Ukraine. And I think that he should trade very, very broadly. In other words, for every square kilometer of Russian territory they give back to Russia, they should get 10 square kilometers of Ukraine back. But basically, Russia should just give Ukraine back its territory and get out. That would be the way the war really should end, if we're talking about what's moral and what's right. But Putin, on the other hand, is, Trump and Putin had a phone call. Trump said that he thought Putin was willing to negotiate. Putin hasn't really been playing along, and now he's recruiting another 100,000 men. He's conscripting another 100,000 men. Doesn't sound to me like a guy who's ready to make peace, right? Sounds to me like a guy who's preparing for more war. And if he does, Donald Trump is likely to rain fire on him. So, and attitudes on the right toward Ukraine are changing a little bit. We saw Sean Hannity have a very, let's just say it was a friendly interview with Volodymyr Zelensky. People on the right are waking up to the reality that the Biden administration, just because Biden's administration supported defending Ukraine, did not mean that Ukraine was bad. Like the wrong people can do the right thing occasionally for the wrong reasons. So that's that. But Russia's advances have been meat grinder assaults. They are losing hundreds of men in these attacks. We have videos of disabled Russian soldiers. They're crawling. They cannot walk, and they're being sent into battle. That's disgusting. If you're injured that badly, you are, as we say, hors de combat. You are no longer a combatant, right? You should be back in a tent somewhere being treated for your wounds, and if they're that bad, really you should go home, okay? You are no longer a combatant. Anyway, just... Whew. But they're gaining, yards, meters, whatever you want to call it, here and there. They're not gaining very much. And it's a slow crawl. And if Ukraine had the right firepower, even that wouldn't be happening. As for Russia, Ukraine keeps advancing into Russia, into Kursk. They just launched another breakout the other day. They advanced 5 kilometers in a day and took, more Russian territory. The North Koreans came there to fight, and, there's something like 12,000 North Koreans. Basically, they're all dead now. They were just sacrificed like cannon fodder on the front. There are not going to be any of them left soon. And what few are going to go home are not going to bring back any valuable lessons to teach their comrades back in North Korea. So there you go. So the situation is not quite a stalemate. Ukraine is still gaining in Russia, as Russia is making very slow gains in Ukraine at great cost. This kind of reminds me, if I could just a quick tangent, this really reminds me of the war that Heraclius, emperor, the Vasilevs, Heraclius of the Byzantine Empire, fought against Khusrau of the Persian Empire, because Khusrau II had his armies besieging Byzantium, Constantinople, right, out in Turkey, now modern day Turkey, and at the same time, you had Heraclius had his Roman army, his Byzantine army, besieging Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire. And so it's beautiful, my friend. Like, so both countries were besieging each other's capitals, and the Persian political system blinked first, and Khusrau was thrown out of power. They negotiated a deal, and the war ended. But between the plague and the war, both countries were spent, and Islam showed up, like 20 years later, and finished off Persia and drove the Byzantines way back into Anatolia. Right. In any case, it's kind of like that. Like, Ukraine's advancing in Russia. Russia's advancing slowly in Ukraine. It's not quite a stalemate, and the situation is pretty fluid. With the right firepower, though, Ukraine might be able to do it, and they're getting the Mirage 2000 now. So, Ukraine now has another plane that can carry cruise missiles and launch them. Better than the F-16, actually. And maybe they might be getting the Gripen soon, Sweden's plane that was developed to fight Russia, to fight Russian planes. So that'd be good. All right. It's another episode, my friends. I'm trying to keep it short. Right now, I'm going to do something a little different than I've done before. I've talked about trying to be a little more entertaining, so I've decided to add a joke. If you have been patient enough to listen to me and you have not fallen asleep, by the end of the episode, I'm going to throw in a Jewish joke just so you can enjoy that. Okay. So, there are two guys, Mendel and Yossi, and they love baseball. Baseball's their favorite thing. If they're not in the shul on Shabbat, they're at a baseball game somewhere. They love baseball. It's all day, every day. They're going to baseball games. And as they get older, Yossi turns to Mendel and he says, someday we're going to die. I wonder if there's baseball in heaven. And Mendel, he ponders this for a second, and he looks back at Yossi and he says, I'll tell you what, whichever one of us dies first, come back to the other in a dream and tell him what to expect in heaven, right? Is there baseball in heaven? Okay. A few years later, Yossi, he gets old, he passes away. Mendel goes to sleep one night, he's dreaming, and he sees Yossi. He says, oh, Yossi, you've come back to me, and this thing. And Yossi says, yes, I'm in heaven, things are good here. I've got good news and I've got bad news. And, okay, and Mendel says, all right, what's the good news? Oh, we've got so much baseball you wouldn't believe. 24/7, I'm playing baseball all the time. I love it. Heaven is great. Baseball's awesome. So Mendel says, okay, well, what's the bad news? And Yossi says, well, the bad news is you're pitching on Tuesday. So with that, and that's my Jewish joke for today, I will say, as always, goodbye, lehitrot.
Writers of the history, stand with me, look into my eyes and see, people go away but never say goodbye. Someone stole the moon tonight, took my light, everything is black and white. Who's the fool who told you boys don't cry? Hours and hours and flowers, life is no game for the cowards. Why? The time goes by. Every day I'm losing my mind, holding on in this mysterious ride, dancing in the storm. We got nothing to hide. Take me home and leave the world behind. Baby, promise me that never again. I'm still wet from this October rain. October rain. Living in a fantasy, ecstasy, everything is meant to be. We shall pass, but love will never die. Hours and hours and flowers, life is no game for the cowards. Why? The time goes away. Every day I'm losing my mind, holding on in this mysterious ride, dancing in the storm. We got no Still wet from this October rain. October rain. אין שום, אין מקום, אין אותי מיום ליום. כולם ילדים טובים אחד אחד. Bring them back home.